You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by HomeField Apparel.
Saw the games,
physical basketball
and I was at the games.
versus
You were
physical
there.
fouling.
You watched them on YouTube.
Anyway.
I saw the games. I watched the games.
Well, we're here. I'm Bob Moats. Welcome to X's and Joe's, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Weemuth. Welcome you to episode 11, Hoosiers. It's not a documentary. Recorded on the afternoon of June 2nd, 2024. So, Robert, happy June.
Happy June.
Yeah, I hear your annual Moats golf outing went off without a hitch. So congrats on that.
A little bit of rain. Other than that, you know, we had our usual four teams that went out there and theoretically competed for 18 holes of golf in a scramble format. We dodged some rain, but for the most part, it was a good day. So, hey, successful. Number 24 is in the books. 25 will be next year.
That was my next question. Like, you know, how many have you done? Because, yeah, I was trying to remember. It was around like the early 2000s this all started.
I know we used to invite you, but I don't think you've actually ever played in a Moats Open.
No, because remember, I moved out to Philly like the second year you had it. And I think the first year I was doing something else. So, yeah, that's why, unfortunately, I've missed it every time.
Which, again, probably is better for you and for everyone associated with you because it's it's designed to do what it does. So we had a great time as always. So
okay, no, glad to hear.
And how are you handling the loss of one of our favorite Bloomington institutions? Now,
oh yeah,
few weeks.
Yeah, we do it. We have to pour one out for one of our favorite haunts back in our time at IU. The Irish Lion is officially closing, or it has closed, right?
It's closed. It's closed now. So now, do we pour out a full yard or can we do a half yard?
Or I think since it's totally gone, so it says full. You know, it's absolutely deserving of that commemoration.
I think a full one of black and tan seems appropriate for me.
Yeah.
And your choice was a little different, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I always did. Let's see, the fish and chips with Bass Ale, and you did Blarney puffballs, right? With something else.
I would do the Blarney puffballs. I would also do. They had a mutton burger that was actually really good that I liked there. Yeah, that was on the pub grub menu because there was also a full dinner menu that you could go to, like when mom and dad showed up and were picking up the check.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, the prime rib was actually really good at the Lion. That was, and I usually didn't eat like like big steaks outside of Yanko's at a bar, but they actually had a really good one.
It was always a half roast duck they had a stuffing with it and some like Irish potatoes and
exactly.
I never like the only place on earth I've ever ordered a roast duck was at the Irish Lion.
Yeah,
but
I was thinking the other day, just like if I did a full financial tally of my expenditures at IU, I think the Lion would probably be number one in terms of like dining out with, like McCree's number two and maybe Opie's number three.
Well, we can't forget another place that's lost, the Bloomington Denny's. But do we actually count that as dining, or was that those are more business expenses, I guess? Yeah,
I mean because it's a chain. I mean, I don't feel sentimental about it, but yeah, I mean, we spent since it was always open for us. We could always stumble in there at 2 a.m. for some needed victuals,
whatever the situation called for. Yeah, that's what I remember at the Lion. We could go upstairs and all of us could be there because that was like the one place in Bloomington where those of us over 21 could get a beverage and those under could drink a Diet Coke and hang out.
Yeah, I mean, I always said the second floor at the Lion for us, us political nerds within our friend group, that was like the DC. I guess the equivalent of the round robin bar for DC within Bloomington.
Or Locke Miller's in Indianapolis.
Exactly.
You go to Locke Miller's there, right there at the State House.
It's the one place we could have those 1 a.m. debates, over things like, foreign policy or environmental regulation that, us 20-year-olds had so much influence over at the time,
But damn it, we acted as if we did. I remember with one of our friends having one over the 55 versus 65 mile an hour or at state a federal speed limit. That was what it was. It was over the constitutionality over a speed limit. And I was like, oh yeah, we're going to go 15 rounds on this. Why? Because we had nothing better to do.
Yeah, exactly. What else?
But that was a lion to us. That was a lion to us.
Exactly. So many good memories. And yeah, I think I reminded you recently of that incident. Was it like 98, 99? When,
yeah.
As we're walking out of the line, myself and our mutual friend answered that age-old question: what happens if you shout "God Save the Queen" in the middle of an Irish pub on St. Patty's Day? And
I know my answer to that, which is that's why I always got out of the bar in front of you guys instead of behind you, because it's like I don't want to be on the front line of that one. I mean, it's every time you travel with the good one, our good friend who will remain nameless, and I hope you're doing well. We genuinely hope that you're doing well, but it's like, no, I'd rather be, you can take it, and then I'll try to pull you out of there. It's easier to pull you out from behind than it is in front. I'll put it that way.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's many great memories, and I've hoped. I'm actually going back to Bloomington later this month, and I will probably drop a flower in front of the old place just for the sake of commemoration. So
let me know. I'll probably join you over there. I mean, with the arduous trek that I have to make, we'll put that on the stop of places we got to stop by when you're in town.
Yep, exactly.
Speaking of nostalgia, speaking of that era, you had a brilliant find on the HomeField website recently, or the app recently.
I did, yeah. So because it's summer and baseball season is obviously upon us, HomeField Apparel just dropped their Diamond Classics premium baseball and softball line. And they had some great items in there, but the one I really loved and I think people should check out is the 1980s University of Arizona vintage baseball pullover. As a kid, I loved that jersey design that Arizona Sports had. It was it's like the script Arizona, the cactus and the sun rising over that kind of weird looking dot matrix version of the mountain range. And I would probably say that that's definitely on my list for purchase. Even if it's not for myself, I do know a friend in the local area that's a big Arizona fan. I think I'm going to maybe make that a Christmas gift for them. So, and as we are talking about Indiana high school basketball players, I distinctly remember East Chicago's own Kenny Lofton wearing that design back in the 80s when he was a two-sport star for the Wildcats, playing basketball and baseball. And Craig Lefferts, do you remember him?
Barely.
Yeah, I think he was like a relief pitcher, or he's a pitcher for San Diego or something. One of those big burly dudes back in the 80s, late 80s. I vaguely remember him being an Arizona star. So yeah, that's one to definitely check out. And they've got a host of other schools available, but make sure to check that out and all the other stuff on the HomeField Apparel website. You can find all the good premium gear at homefieldapparel.com. So, Bob, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to be chatting about the movie Hoosiers and the mythology, let's say, that seems to have been, I won't say created around the movie, but maybe was sort of unearthed around the movie and sort of formed after the movie's release. But first, I'm guessing most fans that are probably watching this have seen the movie Hoosiers, so we're not breaking any new ground here. But the film
spoiler alert: Hickory wins.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, don't make any bets with friends. That.
I bet that other team's going to win this because no, Hickory wins.
Look how big the other team is. There's no way they can beat them.
Yeah, no way that can happen.
Yeah. Yeah, but the actual story that it's based on, which is Milan High School in Indiana, was a real event, and the filmmakers, I guess they did not say it was made for the sake of the Milan story, but they sort of use the framework of Milan as sort of the backdrop. So maybe we should begin by walking fans through that era to to sort of explain like how the story played out and how it did or didn't match up with the film itself. So for your sake, let's walk through what is the Milan story.
So, and really, when you look at it's called the Milan Miracle, but there's a bar in Broad Ripple called Plump's Last Shot. And I'm sure some of you have been frequent of this institution, has a great tenderloin, your usual selection of beers on bottle or on tap. But it's called Plump's Last Shot for a reason. When you walk right in, you see a picture of Oscar Robertson as a sophomore standing next to Bobby Plump, the owner of the bar, and who they loosely Jimmy Chitwood, Bobby Plump from a gameplay standpoint were the same guy. And Ray Kraft are standing next to Oscar after the 1954 semi-state. Now, before that semi-state at Hinkle, at that time Butler Fieldhouse, Milan wasn't exactly what you would call a surprise team. And we'll have in the show notes a few articles about this era in particular, if you're more interested in the players and what actually happened in that tournament specifically, and a little past it because it's a very fascinating story. But Milan had actually went to the Final Four the year before in 1953. They had a first-year coach, I believe, by the name of Marvin Wood. He was a fresh graduate of Butler, played for Tony Hinkle. And he came to Milan and after they fired a coach over some issue with uniform purchasing. And basically it was one of those where the superintendent and coach didn't get along, and the coach finally gave the superintendent a reason to get rid of him. So therefore the coach goes. The town throws a bit of a fit. New kid comes in, makes some changes. The town, it wasn't like, there weren't torches in the streets, unlike kind of what the movie portrays. But there was definitely a feeling of, well, this is a little different. We're not sure how it's going to go. Marvin Wood kind of put his own offensive principles into place, and we'll talk about that probably a little more as the show goes on. But also tried playing man defense, but realized he couldn't play man, so we actually switched him to zone. They called it a 2-1-2 as functionally a 2-3 zone, and he brought the middle school coach, the junior high coach, in to coach it with him because he had great relationships with the players. Now, the secret out of Ripley County, which is where Milan's located, was that this team was really good and had been since they were coming out of diapers. They had some really good players. And again, we talked about Plump and Kraft. The rest of the group, they just gelled well together, but they also had a great deal of skill. And so when they came up short in 53, Wood decided to take Plump and Kraft and company on the road and played a much tougher schedule. They played a holiday tournament in Frankfurt. In that tournament, they actually they didn't win it. Their first loss to that Frankfurt team, but they lost to they actually beat Columbus at that point by 3. That's going to be significant in a minute. And then they just went through I think they won the Ripley County tournament that year. They played all of their home games at Versailles, which is a town right next to Milan. It's slightly larger. They had a larger gymnasium because people wanted to see this team play. They were not really a secret by any stretch of the imagination. They didn't come out of nowhere to take the basketball world by storm.
Yeah, which is kind of the theme of the movie, right? It's like
no
one saw them coming.
And when they didn't have Jimmy, it's like, well, we had to get Jimmy back, and so and that part of the mythology. And again, this is where Anspaugh's direction and Pito's writing is brilliant of just kind of telling a wonderful Hollywood story. But at the same time, things were a little different in that. You fast forward to the semi-state in 54, which was played at Butler Fieldhouse, which is where they were going to play the state finals that year. So the iconic scene of dropping the tape measure and, we've never been in someplace this big. Well, they've been there before, and now they're going to be there for semi-state. Milan actually plays a team in the first game of the Sweet 16. It was a school that was half of Milan's size. Montezuma, Indiana.
Even smaller, than Milan.
Montezuma is not even a high school anymore. Milan still is. You can, they're still there playing out of Ripley County. Kids are still going to class there. But Mike, I believe it's out of Park County, which is close to your neck of the woods.
Yeah, I mean, I think it became Riverton Park, and that's my neck of the woods in Indiana. around Terre Haute. It's about 20 to 25-minute drive outside of Terre Haute, like north and east. And yeah, it was a tiny, tiny school. I believe the graduating class that year had 14 students total. It was 7 boys and 7 girls. And I think all the boys, I believe, played on the team. They had to.
Mhm.
So it was, so they were much, much smaller even than Milan. And yeah, with I joke that, the 7 and 7 class that year, just imagine if you're like a guy that like transferred in and you're the 8th guy and with 7 girls. So that would have been a great sort of like musical chairs during prom season, just like trying to figure out like, who's going to be left out of this little
or who's calling their cousins in. We have 2 cousins from the town over. Should we bring them in for this?
Yeah, I don't want to be the 15th wheel here.
No, I don't know. No, absolutely not. And Milan actually won that game by 10 points and was able to kind of not coast through it, but at the very least, it was not an exerting game.
Yeah.
The game after it was actually the other Sweet 16 game was between Crispus Attucks High School and Columbus High School. Columbus had not won a regional in 16 years. They were still playing in the old gym at my old middle school, which is now a football field. The new middle school is right next to it. They were playing, it was right before the community built Memorial Gymnasium, which is now Columbus North's main gym. And so Columbus and Attucks battle it out, and North was actually winning that game by 10 going in the fourth quarter. North loses at 68-67. Oscar Robertson played in that game as a sophomore for Attucks. He went 12 for 15 from the field and 10 of 13 from the line.
Efficient.
So, yeah, it's like not the Big O's great game. And I taught at Attucks for a few years, and as I was up there, the story always was that Oscar was a little under the weather for that game that Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
And after the game was over, Jimmy Angelopoulos of the Indianapolis News actually wrote an article describing that first game and referred to it as alley ball, a street fight. The Columbus players were overly aggressive and physical and just pounding on the kids from Attucks.
Yeah.
And Attucks comes back and wins that 68-67.
Mm-hmm.
So they go into the second game. Basically, they're gassed, even though it's in their hometown.
Mm-hmm.
Even it's and Milan was able to win that game by double digits against Attucks. Where the picture gets taken after that game, and there was always that link between really Crispus Attucks and Milan, because after Milan wins in 54, Attucks wins back-to-backs under Coach Ray Crow, 55 and 56, and then wins with former IU, the first African-American player to ever play in the Big Ten, Bill Garrett, coaches Attucks to one in 59.
Exactly.
An incredible run, an incredible documentary called Attucks, the school that opened the city, that's available on PBS. You can look that up, for various areas, but it's amazingly well done documentary.
And Hallie Bryant was around that time.
Yeah, Hallie Bryant was he played, I think it was in 51.
Oh, so he's
and
before.
It was before. He was, and that team actually made the Final Four also.
Yeah. And then he went on to be, he went to IU and then went to the Globetrotters, right?
Went to the Globetrotters.
Yeah.
And as after Attucks gets bounced, so yeah, it's an amazing story of that decade of the 50s. And Attucks also just won one recently in 2017. Mm-hmm. Chris Hawkins and Nike Sabante was on that team, and a few others just really did an amazing job of bringing Attucks to another state title. But I know at this point, they make the final. Milan makes the Final Four in that year of 54, and they go back there and play Terre Haute Gerstmeyer in the Final Four.
Exactly.
And there's a story there, isn't there, Mike? Isn't there some controversy surrounding that game?
Yeah. Just a little full disclosure, being from Terre Haute and being that my dad played basketball in Terre Haute in the late 50s, around that time at Wiley High School. So, there's Wiley, Gerstmeyer, Garfield, Schulte, a few others. But Gerstmeyer was like, an in-town rival. And so the story about Gerstmeyer in that particular year was that they had three guys all from the same family. There was Arlie, Harley, and Harold Andrews. So there's the Andrews twins were like Arlie and Harley. Those were the two brothers. That Harold was their uncle, but he was actually younger than the twins.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, try to piece that together. But let's just say the Andrews family was quite large, and they kind of spaced their children out a little bit. So so during the game that they lost, I think it was like a 1 or 2 point game that Gerstmeyer lost. Late in the game, I believe that Arlie got called for a foul that Harley committed, and that put him in real bad foul trouble. Whereas I think Harley was not, actually in much foul trouble, and they had to sit him, and that basically the story goes in Terre Haute that kind of cost them the game and possibly the championship. So to this day, there's this discussion about what would have happened if maybe they had called the foul appropriately, and maybe Terre Haute had a chance to win. So yeah, I mean, in Terre Haute, that 1950s era in Terre Haute was kind of the golden age. I mean, you think about Clyde Lovellette, Slick Leonard, Terry Dischinger, Tommy John, played around then. So, and the Andrews. So that was. But that Gerstmeyer team was kind of considered to be maybe the best of the best in Terre Haute around that time.
And it's funny because we're talking about that was launching a golden era in Columbus of basketball with Bill Stearman at Columbus High School, then Columbus North, and then also a period of time where after when Columbus East when the school split, East actually made a Final Four in 1976, I believe, as well as North making multiple Final Fours before then. So really, it's this kind of the connectivity of these eras. Milan won. I just looked up. I have my handy dandy Indiana school record book from 1990.
Wow, look at that. Is that Damon Bailey and
Bailey and Eric Montrose? This was after, I think it was Bailey's senior season. That's the last one that's in here. Nope, I'm sorry. It's Montrose's junior year when Lawrence North won it. So if you ever find this at a garage sale, guys, kids, pick this up. It's an invaluable guide. Has team photos going all the way back from the beginning. But that was actually a 12-point loss for Gerstmeyer. So, but that actually kind of speaks to Milan. It was 60-48.
Oh, was it? Okay.
But
maybe the lore had to change the story. But
again, different era of basketball, and Milan was very good. They ran what's called cat and mouse offense. Now, what that is for those of you playing at home.
Yeah,
it was an early derivative of four corners.
Yeah, it's a delay system.
But it's also a delay with more of a dribble drive element. Because if you look at basketball in the 50s, a lot of cutting, a lot of picking, a lot of repeated pattern movements back and forth.
Yeah.
This was designed. They had some sets. Now they did run a picket fence as a blob play. They ran some other things, but I mean, really, it was a dribble drive. Yeah. And I think the kicker here was when you look at these games, Milan was able to take the air out of the ball effectively. Like in that final against Muncie Central, they end up, Bobby Plump stands at the top of the key for about 2 minutes and just holding the basketball.
Yeah.
And daring cat and mouse, daring them to come out, and then they would drive the lane. And if the layup wasn't there or the 15-footer wasn't there, they kick it out. Yeah. And they were actually probably displayed better shot selection than most teams in the 50s. Because if you watch the Muncie Central team go down, if a kid had daylight in the 50s, it's going up.
It's going up, yeah.
It's going up. And it was just a total, again, this kind of fuels what we think is a mythology here, where the game was more pure. Yeah, sometimes the game did look more like something you'd see a bunch of 12-year-olds playing in a front driveway than it actually does basketball today.
Yeah.
But Milan wins the state title in 54, as we all know. Plump hits the last shot.
Yeah.
And the story goes
from the spot basically that the movie depicts. That's one thing the movie kind of gets right.
The movie really gets when you think about that last sequence, they got that thing down to almost a perfect clone of what happened. Yeah. But what really happened then is, so Milan, they become the toast of the state, and the team ends up they get their They get their fire engine ride around Monument Circle, which is what the tradition was at the time. This is significant. They go back. 40,000 people crowd the streets of Milan and welcome this team from Ripley County home. The line in the movie about all the small schools, yes, that is the narrative. And I'm not going to say that the team was, quote, forgotten. But what I will say was it kind of goes back into the lore of Indiana basketball for about 30 years. One thing I want to make sure, I want to be clear on this point, that I want to make sure we talk about, I'm just going to address it briefly, but I want to make sure that it's said in this episode. Milan did get their time around the circle. There are some things you can read in the show notes articles that will talk about Attucks, Milan, and some of the other issues going on in the conversation. Yeah. Attucks, when they won in 55 or in 56 and 59, they had a community bonfire in the neighborhood near Crispus Attucks, which was the segregated African-American neighborhood in the state of Indiana, in the city of Indianapolis of the time. Mm-hmm. There's legitimate debate, conversation, and even, I would say, hurt feelings over when the Hickory jerseys were brought out by the Pacers. Yeah. Many of the Attucks alums from the 50s and the 60s, and basically said, we get it, but really we're really angry that this, what about us?
What about us? Yeah. Because they're an indie team.
They're an indie team. I think Arsenal Tech's closer barely. Yeah. But Attucks is really close to Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Yeah. Really close. Yeah. And George Hill was playing for the team when the Hickory jerseys came out, and he's an IPS graduate. I mean, there is a legitimate, and again, now what's happened is, I think in no small part because of the movie, and in no small part because people like Oscar Robertson and Bobby Plump and Ray Kraft and the rest of this crew really do a wonderful job of just being together. Yeah. They've done a great job of just saying, let's celebrate everybody. Exactly. And let's be more inclusive in these conversations. But I think that is something that, as we kind of go through the mythology of that era, the mythology of that time, mm-hmm. and how we look back on our past, it's important for us to recognize that there are sometimes still scars and there are still some issues that are left unresolved. Yeah. And then get brought to the forefront when someone's trying to do the right thing and don't always understand the perspective. Exactly. And the perspective to me is what's really important, because we have to think that when they released Hoosiers in 1986 mm-hmm. and the upgrade of doing that movie, the men that we're talking about and the women that we're talking about that were in the movie as high school kids are our age now, Mike.
Yeah, which is scary to think.
You're telling me. You're telling me. Yeah. I mean, in 1986, it was 32 years separated from the Milan Miracle. And 1986 in Indiana, in the state of Indiana, basketball was things were good. And by good, it was almost a gilded age. Yeah. Before I get to the obvious, Larry Bird in his team, the Celtics, win their third, his third title
in 86.
That he had in 86.
Yeah.
So Larry Bird is at the prime of his career. Jay Edwards and Lyndon Jones are in the middle of their 4-title run at Marion.
Yes, I believe there was at least three. I believe
at least three. Yeah, I think it may have been. Yeah. I'll look it up here in a second and I'll correct myself if I need to. Damon Bailey was just coming on the scene as a middle school player out of Oolitic, Heltonville, Indiana, which is right next to Oolitic, which was featured in the movie. Yeah. But more than that, what was the big thing going on in 86 in Indiana? Like, I mean,
book.
Book.
Yeah, it was the book. Yeah, Feinstein's Season on the Brink was published, or it was published, I guess, in 87, but it was recorded in 86, right?
It covers the 85-86 season, and that was Steve Alford, who had just walking out of Newcastle. The comparisons of Jimmy Chitwood and Steve Alford throughout that 87 season were almost they were almost daily. Yeah. Bob Knight and Norman Dale are considered to be like contemporaries in some respects. It's like, it's one of those types of deals that the timing of the movie's release, and again, it was probably more, just being right place, right time, but it was almost a perfect way of kind of framing that era.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you think? I mean, and again, your dad played in that era. I mean, you come at this from a Western Indiana, coming from a South Central Indiana perspective, but there was something special going on here at that time, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was, I can tell you this, like going to movies growing up in Terre Haute, Indiana, I went from, basically from childhood until I was like 18. And when I went to Bloomington, the one movie I can remember where I saw Terre Haute people cry was Hoosiers. It was the only one I can ever remember. And not like, like sadness, but I mean, literally just like tears of nostalgia. I remember I saw that movie twice at the theater. I think I saw it both times at Town South Plaza Theater in southern end of Terre Haute. I saw it with my dad, I believe, one weekend. And then I think a week or two later, my brother Jay came back from school and we just, grabbed it again. And both times I remember like, oh my God, people are crying, and it was all the older people that remember that era. And so it's one thing I always say about, living in Philly and kind of like the privilege of having like two of the sports movies that have best encapsulated sort of not just the sport, but the people surrounding it. As good as the movies of Hoosiers and Rocky, like those two have always been sort of like rated number 1 or 2 in terms of like sports movies ranked in the, the all-time lists. But I think what both movies get really well is sort of like the time and the environment that was taking place. And so I think you're right. There was something special kind of about basketball in that era, not just in terms of like the basketball itself, but just the following. I think like what most stands out about Hoosiers is just the idea that the game is on and everyone is shutting everything down. Like my favorite shot, maybe one of my favorite shot sequences in the movie is they're about to tip off at Butler Fieldhouse, and it shows across the state all this stuff that is not going on. It's like it showed the theater says, close for the game,
Yeah, close for big game.
Exactly. So yeah, that's I think that's what I think the movie does well, is just it captures sort of the ambiance that was taking place. And I think like I said, I mean, I know in like Terre Haute in the 50s, that was kind of like the golden age of basketball, I think, but just generally in the state overall, that was really a time where the game was really kind of developing. You started having more teams are being included like in the championship. And so I think it was definitely the movie was well timed in terms of the era it was trying to capture.
And I mean, you and I are both what they would call city kids. I mean, in Indiana, we're city kids.
Now in Philly, they would not refer to me as that. But
no. I think whenever I go, the couple times I've been out on the East Coast, they're usually saying, "Well, you don't have straw coming out of your mouth." But at the time of the Milan game in '54. There were over 700 teams in the IHSAA, like I think 750-ish, call it that. Yeah. Today there's 400. So the school and there's that also considers that, like Terre Haute, their consolidated multiple high schools into 2. Exactly. Columbus split one high school into 2. So you had Bloomington split one high school into 2. Yeah. But there were lots of small schools like Montezuma that we were talking about earlier that consolidated between multiple schools, came together and created a school in one of the townships, all these old township schools, which Milan was one. Milan survives it, but some others, I think Versailles doesn't. And they end up going into, I believe, South Ripley or Jacksonville, one of those two. I think it's South Ripley. So you start thinking about that element too, where in a very rapid period of Indiana history from 1954 to 1986, and that 400 level's been about that same level, since the 70s. You've seen you've seen communities lose their basketball team, lose their school, that high school that kids went to and met their lifelong friends. Yeah. And they talk about progress as school consolidation. Ollie has in his report school consolidation, indoor plumbing. Indoor plumbing's a thing too, by the way, in this movie, because if you think about it, there were kids who were living in the neighborhood around attics who didn't have indoor plumbing. There were kids at Milan in that time who did not have indoor plumbing. That was before septic was becoming popular. I mean, we still talk about family members who my mom remembers when they got flush toilets for the first time, and mom was 74. So that's why I think why Hoosiers is still a great and relevant movie, because anytime Pizzo and Anspaugh get together and they do one of these, and whether it's Breaking Away, whether it's Hoosiers, whether it's Rudy, they capture so much of what life was like for people and what people ultimately what they valued. And they also do it in such a respectful way. Like if you watch Breaking Away, you see Herman B. Wells at one point in the movie clapping. John Ryan is a university president being respectful of the blue collar traditions of Bloomington and saying we need to do something to improve town gown relations. Yeah. In Hoosiers, the thing I still cry on whenever I see this. When I see Ray Crow and Al Spurlock, who are the coach, Ray Crow was the coach at Attucks, Al Spurlock was his assistant, and they're sitting on the bench coaching that South Bend team that Hickory beats, and they're having the time of their lives. And just that homage to those individuals, those two men in particular, was important to me, as I just kind of mentioned earlier. But also bringing Tom Carnegie back to do the PA announcing. Ray Kraft, who played on the team, is the IHSAA official who welcomes them in. He was working for the IHSAA at the time. So why you take the obvious parts of it being a great movie because it's a great story, but then you add on to that this extra layer of respect for the people that actually were there and did it, who were a part of this. And I've always felt that part of the movie in particular was an important thing, an Easter egg. If you grew up in the state of Indiana and you're someone who values the history of the state, it's really a big. To me, it's a big just a attribute the movie has, a great attribute it has. Yeah. I love the fact that they actually redesigned the courts to have the original,
the old like funky looking lanes. Which was like what they call like the hourglass lane configuration.
Yeah, the hourglass lane, or the
pre Mikan lane, or whatever it was, or
pre-Bill Russell, I think is what it, because between Mike and Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain, we got to get these guys further away, because all they had to do was just this. There's a reason they call it a pivot player. I'm over this other guy, this 7-foot guy, Wilt Chamberlain, who can basically dunk it without leaving his feet, just dropping it over. You got to get him out of the lane. But there's just that, I think the gameplay is phenomenal. All of those areas. Okay, the love story between Barbara Hershey and Gene Hackman's characters it's a bit clunky.
Yeah, just a bit.
But capturing just the feel of just how people in towns, and even today, how people, you go on Facebook, you see this, you go on certain internet websites, you see this, how people feel about the game of basketball in the state of Indiana. Still, it's prevalent, and it's highlighted very well in the movie.
Yeah. I think, when you consider sports movies today and how many of them have the same framework that Hoosiers has, the new coach comes into town, the players and the coach don't get along at first, but then through, toil and struggle, they come together and they win the championship at the very end. That whole framework. I mean, how many movies every year had that exact framework? But you look before Hoosiers, none of them really had that. So it's kind of like that movie was really one of the first that had sort of, especially in like popular movies, like Paramount level and above movie, movie productions that just had, the whole coach player dynamic comes together and overachieves. I mean, that's they've made that movie probably 5 dozen times now after Hoosiers, and that was again because it did so well and it just captured the public's imagination so much. And I mean, when we talk about, and when we get into segment 2, okay, why were people so enamored with this story, the mythology? Why would they follow it so much? In terms of how they view the game in the real world. Because you think about it, in most scenarios in life, Goliath beats David 999 times out of 1,000. The reason people like movies like Hoosiers is because it is a fairy tale. It's different than real life. It's not what typically happens. It's an outlier. People love the underdog story. Rocky knocks out Apollo Creed. The rebellion blows up the Death Star in Star Wars. No one would actually go to a movie if it were based upon what typically happens in real life, right? Like, imagine a pitch to, the studio brass about the opposite of Hoosiers. Here's the premise of the movie. The biggest, strongest, and most talented team wins the championship. Who's greenlighting that movie? Nobody. No one's going to buy a ticket to that movie. So the reason we like movies like Hoosiers,
Mike, we're going to do a movie on the 1992 Dream Team. We need to.
That would be just an absolute.
We're going to do it just like they did Hoosiers.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, imagine, I'm sure, like in that pitch meeting, it's like, well, aren't there any underdog teams in your story? It's like, oh, sure, but the main team just destroys them. There's absolutely dominate them, beat them by 50. So
this is about us losing to the Soviets in '88 and dominating the world for a couple of Olympics.
Exactly.
That's what this is about.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's just, it's just basic human nature. We're humans. We like underdog stories. No one likes to watch something that happens in real life anyway that kind of depresses us, where the big team beats the little guys. So I mean, I guess the takeaway is we can enjoy these films. We enjoy the outliers when they happen, but there's obviously drawback when we try to take the narrative of movies and sort of try to apply them into the real world. And I guess that'll probably lead us into our conversation in segment 2.
I think it does. And when we come back, we're going to kind of get into that misguided mythos and it kind of leads us to being, well, this isn't a documentary for a good reason. So when we come back here on X's and Joe's, we'll dive into that.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Weemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats. Yeah, so Bob, we talked about the movie, Hoosiers, and I guess, over the years in our basketball chats between you and I think we both had some notion in our heads that the film had unearthed some, let's say, mystical narratives that had maybe slipped into discussion around Indiana basketball. I don't think the movie created these myths. Just let's be clear. I don't think the whole cloth that somehow people just started believing things that weren't true in 1986 there and thereafter. I think what the movie probably did is just it gave some pre-existing theories a kind of like cohesive narrative and a inspiring Jerry Goldsmith soundtrack to go along with it. And so people just kind of like saw the movie as confirmation of what they already believed in the first place. And so, yeah, I think if you remember, like some years back, I jokingly started referring to let's say the mythology friendly portion of the Indiana fan base as the barbershop, as typified from that scene where, Gene Hackman first comes in, meets all the Hickory Town folks, and they start, badgering him about his background and coaching philosophy. And I remember, so when I started calling, that part of the fan base the barbershop, you chimed in with a line, I think it was maybe on Peegs or somewhere else, where you said the line, Hoosiers is not a documentary. And I thought that was the perfect framing point for this conversation, that like literally some fans had turned the film into a kind of enduring roadmap for how to run a basketball program. And so kudos for that. I still to this day say that, it's like, and I used to tell other people, like, yeah, Mo says, Hoosiers is not a documentary. And that's like perfect framing for the reality of what this conversation typically becomes, right?
Well, and it's always kind of, as we've been thinking about this, is, when we first said, let's do a podcast, this was one of the first episode titles of, okay, so when we're on an off season, we need to do this one because we've been dying to do this one for a while. And really years, maybe decades would be the best way to look at it. And it's not meant to insult anybody, any stretch of the imagination.
Oh yeah, it's done out of love and because frankly, we're kind of in that boat. It's just, sentimentally, it's just the separation between the sentiment and the reality.
We had, you have to, and this is again what we've talked about over since we started this pod, and all the stuff that we've done over the years, and Mike especially in player, kind of saying, okay, this is what players look like. I think that Hoosiers, the whole idea of the barbershop, we have to remember the barbershop is actually the antagonist in the movie. It's not the hero in the movie. The barbershop is actually the antagonist that comes along at the end.
Yeah.
It's not Darth Vader by any stretch, but it's probably closer to Darth Vader than they are Obi-Wan Kenobi. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
And they had to come along to this way of doing things and really kind of embrace what had to happen for their team to really hit all cylinders. But there is this thing that, this area where I think the modern barbershop has looked at it going, well, Indiana is chock full of players who can play at the Division I level, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they can play at a high Power 5. A national championship needs those players.
Yeah.
And you can always find places on your roster for them because you never know when you're going to need a smart kid from Indiana who can hit jump shots.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's one of those things that, this theory that, Indiana players always punch above their weight. And I think like any myth, there's always some element of truth to myths. Mm-hmm. Obviously, they won't happen unless there's some degree of reality that lies underneath it. So if you look far enough in the past, I mean, there are indicators that Indiana clearly, just in terms of players, was pretty unusual in terms of the frequency of good players they produced, particularly when it came to, let's say, skill sets, especially around shooting. Yeah. Like I remember, you may have seen this too, but the Big Ten Network used to do those little mini documentaries about the best of list. And they had one on the best shooters in the Big Ten Conference history. Mm-hmm. And I believe about half of the players that were in that list were all Indiana high school kids for the whole entire Big Ten. It was like Steve Alford, Rick Mount, I think Jimmy Rail was in there, Scott Skiles maybe, and Jay Edwards, some combination like that. And so you look at that and you think, wow, those are like, how many states are in the Big Ten Conference, and one state is producing 50% of the best shooters. So like just analytically speaking, that demonstrates, okay, there was like something unusual in Indiana's favor then. And you go back, even to some of the other players that wouldn't be on that list, but, maybe they went to other schools or a different era, like Larry Bird, the Van Arsdales, Ray
definitely.
Beatty, Kyle Macy, you can just go down, Monty Tao.
Yeah.
We can probably go through like 2 dozen just list of dudes that just like, like,
the one that
will just kill it from shooting.
One we always overlook at times, and Troy Lewis out of Anderson.
Oh yeah,
was lights out. I mean, he was an amazing shooter.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can say that. Okay, you take that bit of information. Yeah, and Indiana clearly was sort of punching above their weight within, let's say, a certain time frame. Mm-hmm. And I think just as a matter of per capita, Indiana still does produce a good number of players. The biggest problem is, just as time has progressed, is that there are other states that maybe were lacking, let's say 20, 30 years ago, in terms of producing like high-end basketball players that have caught up and quite frankly have passed Indiana. A lot of states that have like these really large metro areas and that have now these like they have more kids to draw from, and they also have like really heavy AAU networks that are now built up. Right. Consider like, just as a matter of comparison, in the last 2 decades, Indiana has, let's say, only 3 Indiana high school kids have started for an NCAA title squad in the last, let's say, again, 2.5 decades. So just 3 kids over the course of like, 20, 25 years. There would be Kyle Guy at Virginia, Sean May at UNC, and Teague at Kentucky.
Kentucky, yeah.
Whereas you look at states like, Georgia, Texas, Virginia, New York, I mean, they're getting kids on title wing rosters at a far, far more consistent rate than what Indiana is. I think Texas, they've had like 3 starters in the last 3 years, like Georgia, like 3 in the last 4, New York, 3 in the last 5. So literally, like by many multiples, some of these states are just outproducing Indiana. So that's like just one of those realities that it's hard to have those conversations with like certain members of the barbershop. That yes, it was true that if you look back, Indiana was absolutely producing at an unusual level. In terms of the number of high-end basketball players that are sitting into college. Now that's not so much true. And it's not even so much that Indiana has like dropped. It's just Indiana was here, and now all these other schools, these states have just caught up with them and in some cases passed them.
Well, and if you look at basketball in the aggregate, and especially college basketball in the aggregate, and we do spend a lot of time talking about the top 2% of Division I. That's really what we're talking about a lot on this program. But you look at NAIA, the Crossroads Conference, where you have Indiana Wesleyan, Marion, Grace College, St. Francis up in Fort Wayne, Bethel College. That specific grouping, and you start looking at those individuals who play there, and every year you'll see multiple Crossroads Conference teams in the NAIA national tournament that's held at different locations. You look at D3 and the quality of Division III basketball and teams scrolling through D3. You look at our friend Tony's brother-in-law Chaz Hines, who left Indiana to play D2 through different community college, junior college, moved through played his way up to a national runner-up.
In D2.
In D2. Played on that a couple of years ago. And so you start thinking about how we have high levels of players, and you start thinking, well, all of the youth basketball tournaments, all the youth basketball leagues, all of the sports plexes, the field houses throughout the state. Most communities have multi-gym field houses. Like you go to Southwest Shelby, they have, I think it's a 6-gym field house. Hope Hauser has a 6-floor field house. And kids in the state spend a lot of time playing basketball. And so you get, I would say, a higher percentage of players playing basketball, especially in smaller schools, that can also filter into D2, D3, NAIA. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be, and they're going to be very competitive and very good at what they do. But when you start putting them out against guys built like Ja'Kai Newton, the game, it's like you can be a really good, you can be a high level dirt track racer. You can even race in the Indianapolis 500. Stan Fox was phenomenal on the dirt tracks, but you get him at Indianapolis, it's a different feel in a different situation.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one thing I always tell fans that intimate to me that they're sort of frustrated about college basketball in terms of like how it's changed and what they prefer and don't prefer about the modern game. And one of my most common nodes of advice is you should find a school at a lower level that plays the kind of style that you like and follow them as sort of like a secondary backup school. Because there's, like you said, I mean, some of those schools that you mentioned, at that level kind of play like a version of basketball, maybe that's a little bit more focused on sort of like, skill sets. It's not, they don't have the kind of athletes that you see in at upper level Power 5, basketball. So you do get like a little bit different flavor of basketball at that level. I know, like, was it Greg Tonagles at Wesleyan, and I know he's like a lot of people I know that are into basketball say, yeah, you got to watch those.
You got to watch them.
Know how to run good basketball. Bellarmine down in Kentucky runs that no dribble motion offense. So I tell a lot of Indiana fans that are like into what's that?
It's Princeton Chin. I mean, it's really, and it's run without dribble penetration. But yeah, it's an amazing. It's fun to watch. I mean, for me, it's fun to watch. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I've pointed fans that say they kind of miss sort of like off ball screen, basketball. I've pointed them to Bellarmine and say, yeah, you should watch this team and follow them because they're a lot of fun. So yeah, it is interesting that those you can still find versions of basketball maybe that, fit you. But trying to sort of forge this identity within like a Power Five context, maybe just is not as doable as it used to be. Yeah, and it's another sub-myth I think that we've discussed before, and you see it frequently in conversations around, well, who should Indiana and other schools offer? And one comment you frequently hear in justifying taking on more Indiana kids, high school players from Indiana, is that only in-state kids will give 110% playing for IU because, quote unquote, they understand the game better, and they'll have the necessary intangibles to create that sort of tough-minded culture that people feel that has maybe been lacking at IU for a while. And I just don't think that's really reality. Like if you took the two of us and then we sort of pulled all the Back Home Network podcasters together and we all crafted like an all guts and hustle team for IU from the past, let's say like 2 decades, I think there'd be a pretty decent overlap in the kind of players that we would probably select. I mean, on top of my list would be AJ Moye.
Yeah.
In terms of like, just guts and, like just tackling guys, for the ball. Dane Fife would be up there. I mean, he bit a guy, in a scramble for the ball. And then you go like, Victor Oladipo, Will Sheehy, these kids that had, sort of like guts, moxie, and, all the sort of intangibles that you're looking for. Well, what did all those kids I just mentioned have in common? Not a single one of them.
Not from Indiana.
Now, obviously, there are in-state kids that do have those intangible qualities. I think Trey Galloway has that. Michael Lewis, Tom Coverdale. There's a host of other Indiana kids that clearly had it. I think what it just demonstrates is that this argument that it's a feature that's exclusive to Indiana high school kids is just not, it does not comport with the reality that we've seen in the game.
I put Eric Gordon and Yogi Ferrell on that list too.
Oh yeah.
I put those two players on that list also.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, we could go through, like just in-state and out-state of these kids. And I think you'd find that, yeah, you can build really robust rosters with kids that have these qualities. It's just they're not going to come from one place or another.
No.
I think if you went completely the other way, if you just didn't recruit any Indiana kids, that would be a mistake because there are a lot of in-state kids that really have that quality. If you did the opposite of just saying, oh, we're not recruiting any out-of-state kids, well, that'd be kind of dumb too. Mm-hmm. So.
No, you kind of need though. Yeah. And again, I think that there is something about having a kid earn a spot at Indiana University. Like Luke Goody has definitely earned that spot. We can look at that type of player and say, we're glad that he's going to be suiting up for the Hoosiers in his final year. Same with the young man they just brought in from Bellarmine. I just talked about him for an assembly call podcast. Can't remember. But you're talking about you're talking about that but it's when it goes to the front of the jersey versus the back of the jersey conversation, when you start hearing, well, if you're not from here, you don't get it. And I think it's one of those things where part of building a team culture is you have to get people to that place fairly quickly. Like they'll have to understand it's like, this is what the environment you're going into. And as the world has shrunk, and it has shrunk, as the globe has shrunk, understanding that when you get into a different type of culture or subculture with the mores values and belief structures, it's something that if you can't figure it out quick, then it's not necessarily, maybe it's something that we need to work through. And I think that is something I think that for the average fan to understand is to give players a chance and an opportunity to get into that, because I think kids will. I think you can pick up on what Indiana basketball means pretty quickly, especially if you love the game and you put this much effort and time into improving your own skills in. You'll figure out pretty fast just how much that front of the jersey means, and then take the attributes of the back of the jersey to complement the front of the jersey.
Exactly. Yeah. There is like a heavy, like you said, cultural component to it. When you think about like, I think this really kind of became more prominent once the internet started becoming a more central feature in basketball conversations. I remember like going back in the 90s, the early internet era, you'd see these, not so subtle campaigns by local fans for, Johnny Jump Shot from Madison or Connorsville or Corden to get a Tenaya scholarship, despite not being like actually actively pursued by any other Power Five schools. And I remember how they would write it up. It was almost like there was a lore around it. Like you think there was somewhere deep in the quarries of Bedford, there were limestone tablets carved by the basketball gods that stipulate IU has an absolute moral obligation to take on as many Indiana high school kids as is humanly possible. And, I've always thought that was kind of hogwash. I mean, IU does have an obligation, and that's to win as many basketball games as they can, through legal means. But this this determined effort to just like load the roster up with Indiana high school kids, I think, I understand it, but it's also a little bit misguided. Because it like you said, it kind of draws back to the notion of sort of like cultural beliefs.
Yeah.
And I think I think we talked about this once before, that Czech British political philosopher, Ernest Gellner, coined that concept of an enchantment creed. Yeah. Which was coined during the Cold War, and at a basic level, not to get into the mumbo jumbo of it, an enchantment creed is basically a story that people tell about a group or country that gives the group a sense of meaning and pride. It's basically just like an internally created feel-good story that tells let's say a pleasing narrative about ourselves. And it's the story that we tell to ourselves at the same time. And I think a lot of what I see in how these stories are sort of crafted around like Indiana high school kids really does feel like it fits rather snugly into, an enchantment creed. And I think, again, like the movie Hoosiers kind of like was, kind of fits into that as well. It's like Indiana kids are they're special. There's something different about them. At scale, not just individually, but like literally across the board. If your birth certificate has the Indiana seal on it, there's something magical about it compared to a kid that's maybe born just like 2 miles over the border in Ohio or Illinois, and the magic just doesn't exist once you cross the border.
And just think about like, take Hoosiers, take Season on the Brink, take Rothstein for a minute, take Rothstein's inclusion of Damon Bailey in the story.
Yeah.
And from a narrative standpoint, you can buy into that enchantment creed of, well, since John Wooden or since Bobby Plump or Jimmy Chitwood, whatever you want to call it, it's almost like electing a new pope or the selection of a new Dalai Lama. There's a new one. The old Lama dies and then they find the new one. It's like as Kunga, who used to drive the fish truck, God rest his soul, about that story. How my uncle got to be Dalai Lama. But you go in '86 and Steve Alford. We and then right there, Damon Bailey's coming in right next.
Yeah.
And then you got to think about the time all this kind of falls off. Who was after Bailey? And that's I think when we started kind of looking at this going, maybe there's something else in play here. Maybe it has nothing to do with where they're from. But again, the fact that Damon Bailey lived in Bedford, Indiana, the fact that Steve Alford grew up in Newcastle, Indiana, the fact that Randy Whitman and Ted Kitchell, those guys, going all the way back to John Wooden, it may just be about the guy and not about where they grew up.
Yeah, and I always, when I get into conversations with people about recruits, especially if they're like advocating for an Indiana kid to get an offer. And again, remember, we're not talking about like all Indiana kids. There's no controversy when it comes to like Cody Zellers, Gary Harris, Yogi Ferrell, Trace Jackson Davis. Like those are just national kids that just happen, like national level recruits that just happen to be in the state of Indiana.
And I'd even argue that because they were here, it helped.
Oh, sure.
That they got better competition. They got better. I would argue that. I would argue that case.
Absolutely, I would too. Yeah. So I mean, I think when we're talking about Indiana kids in this context, we're typically talking about kids that are not at that level. I mean, I think the real debate exists not with, let's say, the kids in the top 100, because almost invariably those kids are probably going to get like offers to IU, Purdue, and everywhere else. The debate is really about those like next level kids that are probably not being actively recruited by a lot of like Power 5 schools. That's where sort of like the controversy comes in. And even like I've always maintained that I think that because you have 13 scholarships and not all 13 will be used, using one or two for like an in-state kid that maybe isn't going to be like a surefire starter, I've always been okay with that being sort of like a standard rules. Like, okay,
Right.
we're always going to have like at least like some Indiana kid that's going to be on the roster that maybe is not like necessarily like starter level material. I've even like theorized that maybe having like an all Indiana walk-on policy wouldn't necessarily be a totally bad idea either. Really like trying to cement some sense of a relationship with the in-state coaches, which again, I do think is different. But I've long feared that appetite for those kids can almost never be satisfied with that small chunk of fans that are in sort of the quote unquote barbershop. Because you remember like after IU signed Anthony Leal and Trey Galloway in the 2020 class, I was thinking, okay, we're kind of done and we can kind of like really build the top of the roster again. That very next cycle, we saw active campaigns online for Luke Brown, Kurt Hoff, Brooks Barnheiser, Pierce Thomas. I mean, to get IU scholarship. So it feels like it's almost a never-ending appetite to just this need to constantly bring in more and more Indiana kids.
And I get why people do it. I totally understand that it's like if you've invested, especially a kid from your town, you want to see them at the highest level possible.
Sure.
But you have to let the process work.
Yeah.
And as they're going through the process, if you start getting that, don't diminish what the kid is doing in high school. The Luke Brown at Blackford is actually a great story. Greg Doyle, the first part of the story that he told was great.
Yeah.
The next part of it, not so great. It's
comparing him to like NBA dudes.
Right. I'm like, it's one thing if the kid, I mean, every 18-year-old kid is going to be starting first baseman for the Yankees, or in my case, the Reds, and going to the moon. I get it. We're all 18 at one point in time. Even parents who have those, and families, they love you. There's a reason, that they feel this way. But, objectively speaking, if the process says one thing, trust the process.
Yeah.
You can't, because then let's say you do put that kid in that position and you put the weight of the state on his shoulders.
Yeah.
It doesn't go well when it doesn't go well.
Exactly. Not for the kid or for the team. Nobody
wins.
Yeah.
Nobody wins, because all those people who have a different expectation are going to look at this and be like, And so that now the enchantment turns into an absolute melees, or again, it turns into disenchantment. And what are we doing here? Why are we? And it just doesn't really, I think it just doesn't bode well for anybody involved.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we should probably also note that, when we talk about this, this is not really an either or conversation. No. There are plenty of sub-elite kids from Indiana that I wanted IU to offer and sign that didn't happen. Like Kellen Dunham from Pendleton. He went to, I believe, he ended up at Butler. He was in Gary Harris's class. And I thought, okay, well, maybe there might be a little bit of complication of trying to bring in two guards same time, but I still like to believe that maybe that was possible. But I really wanted to see him at IU. Scott Wood from Marion years ago. He was like a 3-4 year starter, I think, at NC State. Great shooter. Yeah. I wanted IU to offer him a scholarship. They didn't. So again, this is not something where we're saying like, it's either like, yes, take everybody or take nobody. I think it's the difference between, having a policy where you have to try to take as many as you can versus more of a case by case basis of, how we look at it from the lens of like scouting and scholarship availability.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that what you said about, those two individuals in particular, the process actually worked out pretty well for them.
Yeah.
They demonstrated they can play at a high level. And I think that's one thing the transfer portal can kind of do for Indiana is that if you have a middling kid in that type of situation, maybe by that senior year, maybe by that junior, senior year, if they're ready to move on from a location, you can bring them in for a year or two and have that player play at that upper level at Indiana versus going through a whole 4-year process. Maybe, and that's, I think we're seeing some of that happening, with Indiana right now.
Exactly.
With Langdon Hatton. That's the kid. It took me a second here, but I got it. Langdon.
Exactly.
So
yeah, you're right. I mean, the portal, it's interesting because, you do have scholarship limits, and in the past, like when you gave out a scholarship, it felt like, oh man, this is feels like a 4-year commitment. The rate for Indiana kids spiking way above their ranking is just not sufficient for taking multiple kids, from in-state every cycle, unless it's like an 89 class where you've got like Graham and Cheney and guys like that. So yeah, and it is tough. I mean, and it's true. Like people point out to me, what about the kids that do spike above their rankings? What's wrong with them? I said, there's nothing wrong. It's just that for every Bryant McIntosh that blows up, you've got far more Grant Gilons and Bronson Kessingers and Kevin Easleys that don't, kids that look, they went to a lower level and they kind of stayed there, and that's probably where they were most comfortable. So yeah, I think it's just being realistic about the probabilities involved. Again, everything we talk about on this pod is trying to get people to understand that everything is subject to incremental probabilities. And as much as we want certain realities to be true, they're not always going to play out the way we want, or at least they're not going to play out at the rate that we want them to. That's going to be beneficial for the school that you're cheering for.
And I think that goes into the whole, like when we talk about teams should win more with less, we get into this mindset, and again, you go back to 1986 and coming fresh off the 84 beating of North Carolina by Indiana, and the 87 team, and some of the mythology that even surrounds that group. But I go back to that 54 Milan team. Plump and Kraft both played college basketball at Butler, which was playing Indiana College Division then. This was a college basketball, really a mid-major backcourt, playing out of the same hometown in the same grade out of Milan, Indiana in 1954, and they end up going and playing for Tony Hinkle.
Yeah, which is a much bigger deal than a lot of fans may realize, about how big Butler was back in the day.
You put a Division I backcourt on an Indiana high school team, regardless where you are, they're a good basketball team. Oh, yeah. A very good basketball team, and potentially a contending basketball team, especially if it goes like Truett and some others. I think Truett ended up playing at Franklin College, which is a D3 school. So you had multiple guys on the Milan team who played college basketball in the 50s in the state of Indiana.
Yeah, that's
nothing to shirk at. And so did they really win with less talent? No, they found that it's the no, I don't want to use that in that example. It's like you find a vein of gold on your property, and you as you're digging a ditch, you find the gold, and you're like, holy crap, we're going to be millionaires. Yeah. And it's like it's a once in a lifetime lightning strike. It's a lottery ticket. It's Rocky getting the call from Apollo Creed. It's Wepner getting the fight with Ali before.
Yeah.
Remember, Wepner got knocked out. So all of these things kind of factor into the whole, with the mythos, that it's like you have to look at the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation was this was a good group, and it wasn't like it was a surprise. And I think the backtrack to that is, we talk about the teams that win with less talent. It's not about winning with less talent. It's basically using your talent to your advantage.
Yeah. Exploiting what the few advantages you do have, and like leveraging them differently. Yeah, you're right. And yeah, I think that's probably maybe the biggest mythology that kind of came out around the time of the production of Hoosiers. And again, not that it was something that had come because of the movie, But again, I think it just sort of like spurred on fans to start thinking in those contexts. But yeah, winning with less, Hoosier, in the movie, obviously what people thought was the less talented team won. Milan was probably not a good analogy to Hickory in the same sense. Like, because you would, who would be the craft player for Hickory?
There was Ray Butcher, I think, is who they.
Ray was supposed to be.
And if somebody wants to throw that in on the Substack or the show or the YouTube, let us know, please.
Yeah,
but I think it is Ray Butcher.
I didn't know if that was intentionally like supposed to be that. So.
Yeah.
So the idea that, and I remember conversations around then really starting to pick up this idea is like, well, you don't need that much talent to win. You just need good coaching. You need good effort and hustle and, concentration and all that. So a lot of that really started coming to the fore when I was sort of growing up in Indiana at the time. I would say that a lot of hay was made of the fact that, let's say that Bobby Knight won with less NBA dudes than, say, Dean Smith and John Wooden. Again, kind of going back to one of these, the fact that myths oftentimes have elements of truth. And frankly, that was something that was true. I mean, it was just an over-considered phenomenon where, an example was kind of expanded and made into kind of a cosmic rule, let's say. But it's true. Dean Smith had Jordan Worthy, Bob McAdoo, let's see, Vince Carter, Bobby Jones, Billy Cunningham, Rasheed Wallace, all those guys. Multiple NBA All-Stars. Knight had Isaiah Thomas. So I think people took that little data nugget and sort of contorted that into a story that said, Bobby Knight just won with rosters that didn't have that much talent. But that's looking from the NBA side. Now, if you look at it from the high school side, it tells a completely different story. If you look at the recruiting performance of Knight, like at the height of his tenure, it's just as loaded with high school studs and All-Americans as what Dean had, and what you saw at Kansas and Carolina, Kentucky and all the other places. And obviously we discussed that in episode 1 of our pod, is where we kind of showed like, okay, well, look, 92, 93, Indiana's up here, and all the other schools that we're talking about, they're right in line. So yeah, I think it's this idea that looking at talent from like two different angles. So if you look at it from the NBA angle, then yeah, you can make an argument Indiana just had less NBA talent.
But remember,
what's more relevant?
Remember in 76, all the starters of the 76 team were NBA first round draft picks.
Yeah. Benson was number 1.
Yeah. And he was a year later than the other 4.
Yeah.
But all 5, so yeah, it's one thing we talk about NBA All-Star versus NBA players.
NBA players, yeah. The comparison I oftentimes make is to with Bobby Knight and his talent he had. I compare favorably with, say, Steve Spurrier at Florida and his quarterbacks. If you remember, not a single one of Spurrier's quarterbacks when he was coach at Florida went on to have anything resembling a successful pro career in the NFL. I mean, you think like Shane Matthews, Danny Werfel, they're all basically kind of like washouts that maybe started for a year or two and that was it. But coming out of high school, all those quarterbacks were 5 stars. And they set about just about every record you can imagine for passing in the SEC. So you ask the question, did Spurrier have quarterback talent at Florida or not? If you look at it from the NFL angle, people say, oh, well, no, he didn't. But if you look at it from the actual high school and like, let's say college talent, he actually did. And I think that's the argument I typically present to people who say that Knight didn't have talent at IU. It's like, yeah, he did. It just, not most of the guys were not individually gifted like Isaiah Thomas, but they were high school level All-Americans and guys that could play well within his system.
And had Ricky Callaway's knee not been as bad as it was, he would have played in the league. Dean Garrett did play in the league. I mean, you go look at 87. That's the other thing when you look at that argument, that 87 team. Well, Alford played in the league. I think, didn't Keith Smart play for a couple of years?
He played for Sacramento. Yes, I believe he did. Yeah.
So yeah, even the '87 team, where we kind of look at that group of being, well, that wasn't his most talented team. Well, yeah, but even then,
They weren't truly lacking talent.
no, there was a lot there. And then if you throw Jay and Lyndon in that, going in past that, and you even go into that, into the Cheney years, you had a lot of kids who played in the NBA, and they may never all-stars, maybe just a cup of coffee, but very few people achieve the dream of playing in the NBA.
Exactly. Yeah. What I sense from fans, and I'll see if you agree with this. What I sense from fans in the barbershop is the idea that winning with less talent is a more authentic way of playing basketball. That maybe it's like a more, let's say, pure way of winning games, through coaching, through strategy, discipline, hustle. Whereas like winning just with talent or size or athleticism seems like an inauthentic way of playing. Do you agree with that?
So I'll give you a 100%. I will give you an anecdotal example of that, which in 1996, when Princeton beat UCLA at the Hoosier Dome, where Damon Bailey wanted to sustain basically because of Hoosiers and because of Damon Bailey, they moved the Indiana Finals for a few years from Market Square Arena to the Hoosier Dome.
Yeah.
And came and so they could get populations of 20, 30,000 to watch a high school final. But at that game, Princeton is playing their Princeton chin pass and cut. It looked like Hoosiers. And I was loving it because it's like Princeton could upset UCLA. And all I remember, I remember so much from that game, but one thing I remember was at one point they had Reggie Miller. This is in 1996, I might add. Reggie Miller sitting there, proud UCLA graduate. He turns his hat around, points to UCLA, and boos explode from the Hoosier Dome. And by this point, wasn't like Princeton had like they didn't bring they didn't bring fan planes in, and it wasn't like these were a bunch of Indiana basketball fans who had stayed there. But Rob got a ticket for like $5 to watch that game from a scalper. That's how empty the place was.
Oh, he went.
And
okay.
yeah, he was there with Poulter. We were all there. It's like there it was, and it's like, oh, you got to be kidding me. And you talk to people after, it's like, well, that took us back to '87 when they took Miller over Steve Alford.
That was my next question. Yeah, maybe that was because
that played a factor.
I watched the documentary again with the lead up to the Knicks Pacers. So, I remember that controversy.
And really, it was more that emotional thing of, boy, we really want our hometown heroes to stay in our homes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always work out that way. In fact, it worked out, again, obviously far better for the Pacers and for the state of Indiana, having Reggie suit up for the Pacers as long as he did. But that's that point you're bringing up here was that Princeton game. They're back cutting, and it was like a 50-49. It was like Milan beating the it was like Hickory winning all over it. It was Hickory winning all over again.
Yeah.
It was Princeton. I want to add, it was Princeton. It wasn't,
Yeah, it's not like the kids that graduate from Princeton are going to be the underdogs in life. So
no, they've got some advantages.
Yeah, they'll be okay. Yeah,
life will be good. Life will be good.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Yeah, because when I kind of dovetailing off of what you said there, I mean, when I discuss with fans, honestly, the ones especially that sort of buy into the mythology, the consistent theme I hear, and usually hearing it after a few beers with people, is that they typically much prefer the older version of basketball from the past. Is that they just don't find much joy in the game today. I'll hear saying like they prefer the passing offense versus dribble drive offense. They prefer screens leading to shots versus players using step backs or using creative dribbling to create separation. So yeah, and these are from people that that are very honest and knowledgeable about basketball. So they just want the game to be a little bit more like the way they remember it, where it is more coaching and style or system focused versus a focus on like individual player variances in terms of like talent and athleticism.
I would agree with that, and I go even a step further in that, which is that sort of when we talk about disciplined approach before, but that there's a reason why it carries over in football. Honestly, Mike, when you think about well, why don't they just run a power eye anymore?
Yeah,
there's a good reason. It doesn't work anymore. Kids are stronger. Kids are faster. Kids are better athletically. Kids have actually worked the game. They're doing more things than they were in 1985, 1955, 2005, 2015. And that, I think, is where people need to kind of just say, okay, you can still find flex cuts in basketball. You may just not see it. It's like you may, because it's going to happen so quick. And part of this comes down to also what people have to understand. I mean, I challenge people who do that, Mike. Go watch a game from back then, please.
Yeah.
Go back and watch the 55 or the 54 game with Milan. Watch the 56 game of Addicts playing Muncie Central again and blasting them by like 20 plus points.
Yeah, those are on YouTube, and we will put those in the show notes.
We will put those in the show notes and watch this and be like, yeah, maybe it wasn't as pure as I thought. Maybe it's like, maybe there's something else. The way the games are called are completely different. It's actually much more physical today than it was back in those times.
Oh, absolutely.
And Galen Clavio, look at go on his YouTube and you want to see old IU games going back to the 50s. He's got footage there. Watch a game and tell me that's better. I don't see it. I mean, Milan shot 30 some odd % that game. It was, the field goal percentage was, and both teams shot under 40%.
Yeah.
It wasn't pure. It was, exactly. It wasn't, it's not like you remember it. And it's a thing, I think, where people today, some people still have to kind of buy into this. Maybe it's easier to follow. Maybe it's more comfortable. Maybe it's like, okay, okay. I mean, I still want to taste my grandmother's spaghetti and meatballs. I mean, it wasn't, she was a German cook, but she made good spaghetti and meatballs. It wouldn't hold a candle to what I get at Iaria's. But to me, because of the way it was made and because of the love, and you feel that love. That's what I'm getting at, is you feel the love of what of your childhood. It's what nostalgia actually is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, between us, like few people would probably match you and I in terms of our appreciation for the past. I mean, if you think about like our friend group, like you, me, Doug, John, Marty, I mean, I felt like when we were at IU, we were like the only 20-year-olds that spent like 90% of our time discussing events that happened decades, if not centuries before our own birth.
True.
So, so whether you like the past or not is really not the question. It's like, because obviously we do, we do love the old game as it was played, but I think we both kind of recognize that, you just can't take a time machine to a past. And even the time machine to the past may not be exactly what you remember it as, as it was either told to you or maybe as your faulty memory has reminded you. So I think that's a lot of the conversation, is that you can appreciate the past and understand that it was special for its time, but then obviously time moves on. Right now will be the past in the future. Like there's going to be people that, let's say, love basketball in 2024. Their grandchildren are someday going to make fun of them, saying, oh, there's grandpa talking about basketball in 2024, and he's still stuck in 2024, in his old ways. So yeah, this is always like ever evolving. And so I think it's just, trying to be realistic in terms of loving the game for what it is, loving what it represents to us, but also just kind of keeping in mind that, things do evolve, and that you have to be realistic about where things are going. So
agreed.
Yeah.
So when we come back, we're gonna wrap this up with another homage to Indiana great.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Weemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats. Bob, we lost an Indiana legend recently. Tell us about it.
So there, when we talk about Hoosiers, there was another movie made not about Indiana basketball, but that prominently featured Indiana basketball a few years after. And for those of you who followed the 92-93 Hoosiers, there's a reason Nick Nolte was sitting in the stands studying Bob Knight. The movie Blue Chips, where Matt Nover, who played center on that IU team, was acting along with Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway, and Matt Nover was the shooter. We know the movie, and much like Hoosiers, there's going to be a mythology conversation about this, especially the NIL era, because of it was less about the game of basketball, more about what was happening inside the game 30 plus years ago. But the coach, again, played by Nick Nolte, did study, his fictional name was Pete Bell, the rumor always was, not rumor, but it was pretty much said that they modeled the Pete Bell character after a man by the name of Tate's Locke. For those of you who don't know who Tate's Locke is or was, he just passed away in the last few weeks. He was the man who gave Bob Knight his first college coaching job at the United States Military Academy back in the 60s. And Locke eventually worked other jobs in college basketball, left Army to go to Miami, Ohio, dealt with some substance use issues, if I recall, and beat those as a younger man. When he was out of coaching, Bob Knight actually returned the favor, brought him back to IU, brought him to IU to coach with him on his bench back in I believe it was the 80s.
Yeah.
And then when the job at Indiana State opened up, Tate's Locke got that job. And he eventually was fired from that position. Indiana State, as we all know, is a very hard place to win. But Locke, I'll always remember and value him. I never met him directly, but I did hear him speak once. And of all places, it was at Hoosier Boys State. For those of you who don't know what Hoosier Boys State is, the American Legion does these all over the country, but Indiana has a Boys State every year where rising high school seniors go and you run a fake state government, including election campaigns and all of this stuff in a week's period. And you get up at the crack of dawn and you march. I was in the band at Boys State, so the band would march everybody in. You had convocations, and then you stayed up until about midnight, and you did it all again the next day. 5 a.m, there you are, up and at 'em. But I think the second night we were there, Locke actually talks to us. And Tate's
it was held in Terre Haute.
It was held at Indiana State. So actually, yeah, and you got to think, it was held at Terre Haute. So they bring Tate's Locke in to talk to us, and he gets up, and I'll never forget it. The first thing he does is he gets to the podium and he yells out, "Billy Jones from Trafalgar, Indiana, come on up here." And this is a guy with like 1,200 of his closest male friends now. And we'll get to why there are no girls at Hoosier Boys State.
Yeah.
And he walks, this kid is like, you're convinced there's going to be a yellow streak behind him on the stage of the auditorium there, because this kid's like, whoa, what the hell is going on? And Tate is an imposing character. I'll give you that much. And he says, "You might need this, son." Hands him his Boys State ID, which is basically what gets you into meals and everything else. And then, "You might need this later, son." And as the kid, "No, wait, I'm not done with you yet. Here, hold on." Pulls his wallet out, pulls out $1, hands it to him, and says to the kid, "Well, yeah, now you can go. And boys, let me tell you," he addresses the crowd, "boys, let me tell you, there's one, I wanted to show that the only way to make $1 in this world is to have some guts. Have some guts and face some humiliation." And the place loses it.
Yeah.
He also then introduced his wife, who I think was a couple of years younger than he was. And again, this is 1,200 of your closest male friends. I think she looked like she just came off a cheerleading line of an NFL franchise. And that another place loses it again. So by that point, whatever Tate said then on out, I ate my Wheaties and I went to bed on time that night because Coach Locke said so. Yeah. So he was one of those great guys in the game, and wanted to at least just acknowledge his contributions to the sport, as well as to Indiana University, and the state of Indiana, the game of basketball in the state of Indiana. So rest in peace, Coach Locke. Yeah,
he was an interesting character. I mean, I saw him, coach at ISU a few times, and that book, if it's still available, I'm sure you can get like reprints. "Caught in the Net" was the title, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and that I remember that was like a warning to younger coaches.
It was.
It was kind of like a bio, but it was also like, hey, like, and it was based upon his time at Clemson, I believe. So
Yeah,
he
I think so.
Clemson, and of course, he's surrounded by the heavies. He's got NC State, Carolina, and Duke. And he's trying to like edge out as much of a roster and identity as he possibly can. I mean, he got some good. I mean, Tree Rollins came to Clemson based upon Locke being there, so he got some good players. But yeah, it just kind of details sort of like the dirty pool he felt he needed to get into to compete with sort of the upper echelon coaches at that time. And yeah, the one secret, I guess, in the basketball world that some fans may not realize that's related to Tate's Locke is that Bob Knight and Jerry Tarkanian actually kind of liked each other.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was actually because of Tate's Locke. Remember, Tarkanian gave Locke, I believe, his first assistant's job after he got let go from Clemson and all of everything that happened thereafter. So, I mean, no one was going to touch Tate's Locke with like a 50-foot pole around, like the late 70s, early 80s. But Tarkanian gave him a job, and then Knight gave him a job after Tarkanian did. And I know Knight always like gave Tark a lot of credit for that and always spoke very highly for what he did. So yeah, and it's it was the movie was Blue Chips was kind of loosely based on him, and I think how many great character actors were in that film. Just like thinking back, and obviously the theme is always basketball, but like Ed O'Neill, Alfred Woodward, H. Walsh is like the consummate like, 80s, 90s like
villain.
Villain character actor. And well, of course, one of my favorites who had a cameo was Louis Gossett Jr.
Yeah, I played the principal at I think it was Penny Hardaway's.
Hardaway, yeah. But did you think it was funny, like that film, how opposite it was from Hoosiers and how it depicted like Indiana kids? Because remember, like there were 3 recruits.
Right.
So there's Shaq, the Shaquille, or whatever his name was.
It was Shaquille O'Neal. Yeah.
Then Penny Hardaway. So Shaq was like a kid from Louisiana. Penny Hardaway's character was from Chicago, and then Matt Nover was from French Lick. Think about like the scale of iniquity in that film. So they all get offered like stuff. Shaq's character turns down the Lexus, like, oh, I don't want this. Why are you giving me this stuff? Penny Hardaway was kind of in the middle. It's like he knew what was happening, but he didn't necessarily like seek it out. But he wanted his mom to have like a good job. And remember, he comes in and says, "Coach, if I leave, will my mom lose her job?"
Yeah, I remember that scene.
Nover's character comes in. And says, all right, this is what I think I'm worth, Coach. And he goes through like the bill he's basically asking for coming to play at Western University. So
the tractor.
So I always kind of like the contrast from like Hoosiers. Then you come to Blue Chips is like, oh, just 10 years later.
I'm seeing the scene of the butcher boy sitting across from a Branch McCracken character and having the same conversation.
Yeah,
exactly. You just can't see. You can't see it. You cannot see that even being in the realm of possibility.
Yeah, exactly.
But it is interesting because I always feel that Blue Chips, and I'll just kind of briefly touch on this. Blue Chips was kind of the end of the era, and I think it's probably going because Bob Knight decided to put Bobby Hurley in an IU uniform. I'm convinced that had something to do with it. The God said, "Okay, game over, kids." But you take, I call them the breaking away years for IU, where basically from like the opening of Assembly Hall and Bob Knight getting there from 1970 until the mid 90s when we were there. And when they opened the education building, that was kind of the last of those types of projects that were done. But I kind of think that was kind of the end of that era where now IU is trying to find a way to get into the next, whatever the next thing is going to be. And it's taken IU a while to get there. But I think Blue Chips, for whatever reason, just kind of is almost like that bookend of like, okay, after Blue Chips, things just weren't the same. Things just weren't the same.
Yeah. Thinking about like movies and thinking about like, because I mean, there's so many documentaries and based on films that are made about basketball anymore. The one I want to see, I love to watch a movie based upon Norm Ellenberger's time at New Mexico. Speaking of like redeemed coaches that came to IU.
Yep. There's another one.
Remember the outfits that he would wear at New Mexico, like the pictures you'd see, like the wardrobe that guy wore back then. I mean, we remember him just at IU with like kind of like this 70-year-old dude with the nice little like quarter zips, but yeah, he looked quite a lot different back in the 70s.
Herb Tarlick had nothing on that guy.
Yeah, it was like Blue Chips meets Boogie Nights in terms of wardrobe choices.
True, very true. So, well, I want to, before we get out of here, another thanks to Bob Thompson. Special thanks to Bob Thompson for the music you hear on the show. And thanks to John Ringer of jingdesign.com for designing our logo.
Right. And let's see, next episode 12, freshmen and what to expect from them. We'll dive into some numbers and show what typical freshman output is in college basketball, and hopefully set something close to reasonable expectations for fans, because I think one conversation we've seen pop up a lot in the last, let's say, 24 months is, why isn't this freshman producing what I thought they would? So I think we'll dive into that, and I think it'll be a pretty enlightening conversation. So this endless conversation was brought to you by the Back Home Network. Be sure to check out all the great BHN content, including Assembly Call, Doing the Work, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and the Back Home Network. Until next time, I'm Mike Weemuth.
And I'm Bob Motes.
Thank you for joining us.